The following audio presentation is by Bill McGrath, who is the last grandson of lumber baron James E Mcgrath, and I'll let you listen.
Yourself back 121 years, and you're up in the woods. You've arrived there today. It's your first day on the job. And I'd like you to just kind of concentrate on your sense of smell. Because you're out in this woods, nothing but pine trees, white pine. And what you can smell is smoke coming from a lot of different chimneys. There's bunkhouses, there's cookhouses, there's a blacksmith. So you can smell this wood smoke, you can smell some coal smoke. The blacksmith is probably putting out a little bit of that. You can smell some really good smell from the cookhouse. They're making some pies and baking some bread. And you can smell manure because there's a stable nearby. And it's very silent where you are. And it's the 14th of December, 1900. And you have come up because you heard that there was a good lumber camp just east of Mille Lacs Lake owned by a guy named James E Mcgrath. And another thing you've heard about this job is that it features some really good food. And you like food, and you are primarily a farmer. And you actually live down kind of between Hastings and Woodbury. But you're 20 years old, you're a single guy, and you know that you can go up and work in the lumber camps and then come back in the spring and be a farmer. So that's not a bad deal. You're going to get paid $2 a day. Now that doesn't sound like much money. That would be about $65 today. So you're working out in the cold all day long, heavy work, burning up about 9,000 calories a day, and you're getting paid about $65 a day, but your room and board is taken care of, and the rest of your family back on the farm by Hastings, they're carrying on as they can, and you're up here earning some money. So it's not a bad deal for a 20-year-old single guy. Now, how did you get to this lumber camp? You came on a road like this, and they call this a tote road. And my grandfather, James E Mcgrath, made this road in 1895. Some of you probably get up to Duluth from time to time, and you know where Willow River is. And so my grandfather, and we'll get to him in a minute, built this road, and there's you. And that's how you get there. You take the Northern Pacific from St. Paul up to Willow River, and then you join this caravan of people that are transporting all these supplies out into the woods. It's very silent there. There's no cell phones, there's no phones, there's no telegraph, there's nothing. And you are going along, and every now and then there'll be a sleigh that goes along kind of fast, and that might be James E Mcgrath or some bigwig. But mostly everybody's just walking along, and it says 7 hours. It's a long walk. It's a tote road. Here's a wonderful map. Might win an award someday, but you are up here now. You came from the farm, and this is the Snake River coming over to the St. Croix, down to the sawmills. There were 9 sawmills in Stillwater at that time. And just for perspective, I-35 goes up about like this. So you've been in this area before for one reason or another. And Willow River was the turnoff where you come over to get into James E Mcgrath's lumber camps. Now he had, at that time, about 15, 18 lumber camps all working at the same time, and they were all cutting down white pines and bringing them over to the Snake River, and it would take about 14 days, usually, on average, for a log to float from here to there. There's a series of dams on the Snake River made by either my grandfather or people that were working in connection with my grandfather, and they built these dams in order to create 15 lakes. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that was the value of the Snake River in 1900. My grandfather had been at it for a few years by that time. So you have a job, and your job is to provide ice on these trails. This is a John Runk picture, by the way, and this is in the Mcgrath lumber camp up east of Mille Lacs Lake, and this load has traveled 12 miles through the woods. Now you can imagine how tricky it would be to build a logging road that was level enough that 6 horses could pull that much weight 12 miles. That's like coming from North St. Paul to Stillwater. And your job is to get up in the night with a crew and go along with a tank on a sleigh and make sure that there's good ice for these horses the next day. So who was this guy? He died 12 years before I was born. He was a timber cruiser. And he was a guy who could look at a big portion of white pine and decide whether he could make money on it. And he seemed to know every aspect of what he had to know whether it would be profitable or not. Now I say here that he owned about 15%. That's just about a guess, because he probably was also involved in something that was called stumpage. And that would be where he would contact people that owned land that had the white pines. And he wouldn't actually have to buy the land, but he would pay this stumpage to whoever owned the land, and then he would take the trees and they would keep the land. That was very common in those days. He came from Pennsylvania, and his father came from County Wicklow, right there in Ireland. This is Dublin up here. So my great-grandfather came to America in 1853, right after the potato famine. And he married a woman from Philadelphia, and they lived in northeastern Pennsylvania near Scranton. He was involved in a couple of businesses. One was a tannery and one was a sawmill. And he took on a business partner who was a crook. And the crook somehow put the business into his own name and then burnt it down and made off with whatever insurance money he could get from it. So that guy, that great-grandfather, left Pennsylvania. He had some kids by then, including my grandfather, James E Mcgrath, and they came from northeastern Pennsylvania to Stillwater. They arrived in 1878. Now, my grandfather was a teenager, and he got a job in one of the sawmills in Stillwater and worked there for a year or two. And it didn't pay very well, but he was starting to learn the business, and he already came from a family that related to that kind of work, sawmills and timber and so on. So he decided to go up into the woods himself, and he went up into the part of Wisconsin that had a lot of white pines, up by Cable, Wisconsin, and he worked on the Totogatic River, and he worked on the Tamarack River, and probably some other ones, and he did that for about 5 years, and somehow he came up with some money to buy some land of his own. We're going to get to that in a minute. I wanted to just go through this thing about the fire. We talked about that. My grandfather, James E Mcgrath, is a young man by this time. He's been up in northern Wisconsin learning the ropes and getting some money, and he married Emma, 1891. I don't know a lot about her. She died way before I was born. I heard that she had a wicked sense of humor, which comes in handy, and she raised these kids, and they lived in this house. This is about the only house in Stillwater that was owned by 3 different lumber barons. It was built in 1878, and I grew up in that house, by the way. There's a plaque there to that effect, I think. But this picture was almost certainly taken from the roof of the courthouse. I don't think it's a John Runk picture because I've never seen exactly who took the picture, so I'm not going to claim it was John Runk, but it was probably about 1890. You can see the size of the trees. They were just kind of going along. Here's another view of the house. So now we've got my grandfather and his young wife Emma living in this house. And imagine the view that they would have up here. They could look right up the St. Croix River, which they probably did. I can see James and Emma hanging out up there on a Sunday afternoon, and just sounds pretty pleasant to me. So it was a mansion. Another thing about this house, in 1895, the son of a man who had been Vice President of the United States, Schuyler Colfax. Okay, so the son of Schuyler Colfax was married in this house. Schuyler Colfax was not in office anymore. He had been under Ulysses S. Grant. But the wedding took place in this house, and they probably had some other pretty big influential events that happened there in the days of the lumber. Now, this picture was taken a few years back. We actually have 2 people in the presence tonight who live in this house now. So they are quite familiar with this fireplace. There were 5 fireplaces in the house, 38 windows, as I recall, storm windows that had to get changed in the fall. It was a lot of work. It had a coal furnace in our day, magnificent house. And when we lived there, when I was growing up, we didn't have much money. You know, the grandfather had a lot of money, and we did not. We had an old Chevy, and we never went on vacation that I remember. It wasn't wiener water soup, not quite that level, but we did okay. But people that have lived in the house since then, thankfully, have been able to fix up the house. We never could afford to do that, and I'm going to get to that later on as to why we were not able to. But you wonder how my grandfather was able to come up with this much money when he was about 30 years old. And for that, we have to go back to how did the lumber industry get a hold of all that land up there. And so we have a treaty with the people that we would call Anishinaabe or Chippewa, Ojibwe, whatever. This treaty pertained to those native people that lived east of Mille Lacs Lake, also the people of the same nation, the Ojibwe people who lived in Wisconsin. And this treaty actually pertained more to Wisconsin than it did to Minnesota. Neither one of those 2 were states in 1837. It was just a bunch of land, and there was a lot of pressure from white settlers coming in. They wanted the pines. And so the federal government made this arrangement with the people that lived there. You can't really say they owned the land, but they lived there. And in return, they were supposed to get a sum of money for a period of 20 years. And the other thing was that they were supposed to be granted permanent right to fishing and hunting and gathering, which is gathering wild rice primarily. So that was this treaty. Now, it's 60 years later that my grandfather comes across this land, and who knows exactly who owned it all that time in between there, but he did get it, or else he obtained what we call that stumpage system, where he would get the rights to cut down the trees. Here is another wonderful map showing the Snake River. It's not very accurate, but it's good enough, and these are lumber camps. And don't hold me too much to exactly how many lumber camps he had at any one time, but he had a lot going, and each camp had about 75 men. And they would be cutting down white pines, as we saw earlier, bringing them to the river. They would be living in these bunkhouses. They'd be up there all winter, and many of them had another occupation. They were mostly farmers, but they would come up and work in these camps in 1900, which is what we're looking at right now. You'll notice a few towns here just for reference. We have Pine City and Mora, and here's the St. Croix again. So this is what we're talking about, this big area, and just in order to give you an idea of about how big an area he was working with, he wasn't doing logging in the Twin Cities, I don't mean that. But this map shows you about how big this area is, and I've used these names because I know a lot of you are familiar with Stillwater and this area. So each one of those, you can picture about 75 men in each one of those camps back around 1900, when he was pretty much at his peak as far as the Snake River aspect of his career went. So we're back to this now. Now, who were these lumberjacks? Well, this guy here, we'll just pretend he's a Swede, an immigrant from Sweden. This looks like an Irishman to me. And this guy might be what we call métis, which would be, like a French-Canadian mixed with Ojibwe. These are the kind of people that would do very well in a job like this. They enjoyed it, they got good at it, and here they are making another big trip, maybe 12 miles again, all the way through the woods. I don't know how they did it. So they would get the logs out near the Snake River, which is not a very big river. The points that I've seen of it, it's about the width of Pine Street here in Stillwater. It's 30 feet across or something, and it's maybe 2 feet deep under normal conditions. But what they would do is build dams. And there's two guys here from Mcgrath, Minnesota tonight, and they might say a little bit about this too. These dams would create lakes. So what you had, basically, you're turning the Snake River into 15 lakes. And the lakes would freeze. All these logs would get taken out onto the ice. Now first they had to get branded. Each log had to have the name, or had to have a branding on it, not the name of the guy, but my grandfather apparently had S, V, and then 2 slashes, kind of like Roman numeral 2, and then another S. So somebody had to be able to do that very fast and cut that into each log, because when the logs got down to the boom site north of Stillwater, they would get sorted out according to what brand they had on them. So here you've got these guys waking up about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and they would be taken in pitch dark into a bunkhouse or a dining hall that was heated with wood and had a couple of kerosene lanterns, and these cooks would do just wonderful work in feeding these guys. They would usually eat 3 or 4 meals a day, but probably only 2 of them would be in the dining hall. So the noontime meal would be out in the woods, and you might be like 2 or 3 miles away from the dining hall at that time. So a special sleigh would come out and bring you some food. Now, what would the food be? Well, a lot of salt pork, which kept well and had a good energy to keep you warm in the winter. Beans, a lot of beans. And James E Mcgrath was famous for being able to bring fish dinners into the lumber camps 2 times a week. Now, he was Catholic, that might have been part of it. Maybe Friday night was always fish. But amazingly, these were codfish and mackerel and salmon, probably coming from the East Coast. They would catch them there, put them in barrels, dry them perhaps, or preserve them and bring them to the lumber camp. They come up the Northern Pacific Railroad, across on that tote road, and they'd have fish dinners, which was amazing to be able to do that with. My grandfather had about 1,200 men working for him at that point. I have heard estimates even higher than that, but we'll say 1,200, and he had 600 horses. So he was a big operator, and he wasn't that old. It's kind of amazing how he pulled it off. Anyway, so we've talked about what they did in the winter, and then right around March, April, that lake would thaw, and you'd have a scene kind of like this. They would open up the dam. So let's say that you're coming up from Mora. People maybe know where Mora, Minnesota is, and you're coming up the Snake River. You would come to a dam, and there you'd have men who would open the dam, either by opening it, and it could be closed again, or they might dynamite the dam. But in any event, the dam is gone, and then you've got people with these poles really walking along the river, and they would basically walk all the way down to at least the St. Croix. There'd be some interruptions between there, but it was very hard work. You would get very wet. You would be sleeping in tents during this time in wet blankets, and this was a different crew. This would not be the same as the winter crew, although there would be some overlap. But these guys, it was a smaller number. It might be 200 or 300 men doing this work on the river itself, the river rats they called them. And so they're coming down. Now these guys are doing something that is related to the lumbering, and they are out after tamarack trees. And what they want is this. That's called a knee, or a root of a tamarack tree. And they use those things because they are shaped perfectly for building the kind of boat that's going to float down the Snake River and have a cook stove in it, a wanigan. I don't know if you can all see that word on the bottom there. It's a wanigan. So there's a stove in there and food. This is probably on the St. Croix River or some larger river, but this is the kind of way that they were able to feed these guys as they went down the river. And that would take several months, starting in March, April, May, and they would still be at it in the summer. And the object was to get these logs down to the boom site north of Stillwater. So that would take a long time. And then when they got to the boom site, they would be sorted probably by different personnel that worked for the boom site directly, according to those brands that we talked about earlier. The Snake River is a tough river. That's why earlier lumberjacks had kind of avoided working on the upper Snake River. It was just too treacherous, crooked, a lot of big rocks. This is a modern picture, of course, but I think that the only way they could do this was this system of dams. And I don't think my grandfather invented that, but I think he used it very effectively on this river. Now, another problem that came along in the late 1800s was all of this debris that the lumberjacks were leaving all over the place. And my grandfather, when the Hinckley Fire happened, was actually working in Wisconsin. He might have been doing the same thing of leaving junk all over the place to catch on fire, so we won't give him a complete pass on this. But this fire, in which more than 400 people were killed, got the attention of the Minnesota legislature and the people, and they wanted some action on it. And so this led to a law in 1895 where they, for the first time, set up what they called a system of township fire wardens. It was very controversial, and the timber industry, possibly including my grandfather, fought against that. But there were more fires. Baudette had a fire, and Cloquet had a fire, and people were killed, and more and more outcry against what the lumberjacks were doing, the lumber barons were doing, leaving all this stuff. So my grandfather certainly walked right into this whole era of Minnesota history where they were starting to clamp down for the first time on the lumber barons. The Sioux Line Railroad was unusual. There already had been the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern and some other railroads in Minnesota, but the farmers were very frustrated with having to deal with those railroads, like the Northern Pacific, let's say, and also dealing with the flour mills in Minneapolis, and they wanted some alternative to that. So the Sioux Line Railroad got started primarily as an alternative, certainly to those two railroads, but also it was a way of bypassing the Twin Cities and even bypassing Chicago in order to get all of that wheat and other produce from Minnesota out to the East Coast. And the Sioux Line would send trains up through Sault Ste. Marie into Canada, across Canada, and back into the U.S. So it just so happened that one branch of the Sioux Line was built about 1910, when my grandfather was kind of at his height as a lumber baron up there, and he decided to stop using the river and start using the railroad. So he built his own sawmill, and I have read a couple of accounts that said that at that time, this large sawmill, known as the White Pine Sawmill, was the biggest one in Minnesota. And here's a kind of this is a little bit hard to read, so I'm going to just shut up and let you look at this. No, I'm sorry, I missed a slide here, but this was the depot. A town was established, and these two gentlemen here are from McGrath, Minnesota. We might hear from them later on. There's the depot, it says McGrath right there, and there's the Sioux Line. So this was an entirely different approach to lumber, and this way, my grandfather was not selling logs, he was selling dimension lumber, 2x4s and railroad ties and all kinds of things from his sawmill. And you'll notice the river is gone. We didn't remove the river, we just don't have it in the picture here, but they didn't need it anymore. This town, named after my grandfather, was, I think, about 5 miles from that sawmill, something like that. This is not real accurate, but we still have the lumberjacks out cutting down the white pines, bringing them to James E Mcgrath here, and he would send them out on the Sioux Line. And this says Sioux Line, it's hard to tell, but that's what it says. So, this is the picture that I want to just shut up and let you look at this, if you can read this. The extent of what was in this White Pine Sawmill. It was practically a town, although it was never incorporated as a town. But there were hundreds of people living there. We had bunk houses. These would be lumberjacks coming in, like we talked about earlier. 2 blacksmith shops, 4 stables, a planing mill, drying kiln, so that you could use the lumber, faster, because you didn't have to dry it just by natural forces. Office buildings, and look at all the houses. These are people that maybe work in the post office. They had a post office there. There was a store. There was a school. Okay, so it was quite an extensive community out in the woods near McGrath, Minnesota, and it was called White Pine. Here's a picture of my grandfather, presumably up in the woods. that building behind him is probably an office building. It doesn't look very big. But he did spend half of his year up there and the other half back at 416 South 4th Street with Emma and the kids, and they had 6 kids by this point. Keeps them busy. So what kind of a guy was this? Because he died, so many years before me, I only have little scraps of information about him. He must have been very smart, at least in this way of making money off of white pines. He must have really known that inside and out. He probably had very good people skills. His daughter, Helen, who lived in Stillwater, in later years said that he was very honest. He was a soft-spoken man with a dry sense of humor. He did not drink or smoke. He would have been Roman Catholic, although I don't really know exactly how religious he was. And he became pretty well known. He was the last lumber baron in Stillwater, to the point that here's the Minneapolis paper putting a little cartoon in about him. And this date actually is 1935 right there. So James McGrath, last of the picturesque Stillwater loggers, known as Tamarack. That was his nickname that he got way back when he was in Wisconsin working on the Tamarack River. So this is just a little tribute to him, and he was still alive at this time that this came out. So now we have him up with this white pine sawmill near McGrath, Minnesota, making a lot of money, employing huge numbers of people, 1,200 people or more, maybe 2,000 is one figure I heard. And because they were no longer using the Snake River and the other lumber barons were not using the St. Croix as much, the boom site closed. As many of you know, if you grew up in Stillwater, you know the boom site was a very bustling place for 70 years. It was a busy place. And he kept on using the Sioux line and his own sawmill. But then another bad fire happened. There were 4 fires in my grandfather's life, including the one in Pennsylvania, that set him back. This sawmill burnt down. Now, $500,000 back then would be about $15 million now. And he was accused of starting the fire. A forest ranger from Moose Lake had him hauled into court up there, and he was acquitted. Now, that doesn't mean he was not guilty, but it means he was acquitted. He certainly did not seem to have a pattern of being a dishonest guy. And fires were very common in the timber industry. So I looked into this as best I can, and I want to look into it some more. I could go up to Aiken County and look through old records, and I haven't done that yet, but I did come across some eyewitness accounts. For instance, there was a woman, and her name is Myrtle. If you're in Stillwater, you know Myrtle Street, so it's easy to remember her name. Myrtle Roberts, and she married a guy named Schultz. So by the time she got interviewed about this whole matter, she was Myrtle Roberts Schultz. She was 15 years old at the time of this fire, and she was living in the White Pine Sawmill community. Her father worked there. She lived with her mother and 2 younger sisters. And what she said about this fire, it was September of 1921, and the woods were completely dry, and there were fires kind of breaking out here and there, and people were trying to extinguish them. They had the National Guard up at station near McGrath, Minnesota, to help in case there was some sort of a fire emergency. And On the 5th of September 1921, this Myrtle said that they had been having burning embers and smoke coming their way from outside of the sawmill for a few days, and they had built what they called a backfire. In other words, they built their own fire to try to get rid of any debris so that it wouldn't help this fire spread into the sawmill. But she said that one day in the early afternoon, all of a sudden the sawmill was on fire. And she fled with her family and other people. Now this is 1921, and they had some Model Ts, but a lot of these people were fleeing just by running or walking away from the fire, and they walked up to a place called Solana. They walked to another place near there called Ardile. Say it again. Arthite. These were sites along the Sioux line, and they were able to get on a freight train, not a passenger train, but a freight train that took them to Mcgrath, Minnesota, and they were okay after that. Nobody died in this fire, but you can see, he said he lost $500,000, and that's about $15 million in today's dollars. So it was a big deal, and you'd think that would pretty much wipe them out. Having lost all of this, there were a couple of buildings that were still up. The school, of all things, did not burn, and a couple of the houses and I think a few other little things did not burn, but it was very bad. Here's a picture of my grandfather in his later years, and this is downtown Stillwater. So he did have an office downtown, and then of course he would be up in the woods quite a bit. This is the Mauer block. Some of you can probably remember that term. This would be like across from kitty corner from Shorty the Cleaner, or Kinzel Liquor, or the First National Bank, or if anybody wants to go way back, Goggins Candy. You probably could name some other ones too. Anyway, so he was across the street from that, and the building is no longer there. Now up here, these are probably not nursery rhymes. These are probably maps and legal descriptions of properties, because that's what he had to know that stuff. So he's back again in his later years, married to Emma. The kids are pretty much leaving the home, and life was still pretty good, but the sawmill was gone, and his money was probably starting to kind of slip away. And then another bad thing happened, and this is the fourth fire. The house itself caught on fire, 1926, middle of the day. There were people in the house, and after that fire, the house looked like this, which it kind of looks like now. This is actually a watercolor painted by a woman whose name was Jo Lutz Rollins, and she was an art professor at the U of M, and she started an art colony in Stillwater, and she would bring these art students over to Stillwater in the summer, and they would paint mansions and other things like that. They actually lived in this house for a while. One summer, the art colony was in that house. But meanwhile, the town itself had fallen onto hard times. With the lumber gone and those 9 sawmills shutting down, there wasn't really a good replacement for that industry in Stillwater, and a lot of people moved away. Stillwater was bigger, and then it got quite a bit smaller as the lumber industry kind of slipped away from them. And they started lumberjack days. And these guys here, reportedly, they have the names of everybody. These were old-timers up in the woods, possibly working for my grandfather, but whoever they were working for, they got together and they started this celebration, 1935, I believe it was. Now this guy is my father, probably in his mid-20s.
There is a second part, so stay tuned. I'll be recording the second one next.